So what we're going to do in this session is we're going to talk about Vue.js. And before we get started on that, I just want to take an informal survey and see what folks are using. How many people are using, let's start with Angular currently. Wow, that's quite a bit. How many people are using React? Okay, that's the other half. Anyone using anything else besides those two? Yeah, go ahead.
We have some old Moo tools.
Moo tools, wow. That's a blast from the past. Anybody else? Which one? Polymer. Okay, wow. That's web components. Anyone using anything more esoteric like let's say Batman.js or anything like that? It seems like there's new libraries all the time in this space. But what's happened over the last few years is it seems there's some consolidation around the different libraries so that the big three now are Angular, React, and Vue.js actually. So, and that's what I'm here to talk about is Vue.js. How many people currently use Vue? A few people? Okay, so you might be a little bit bored. Real quick, there is a nice conference coming up in Florida called VueConf US. So we're checking out Evan Yu and a lot of the Vue core team will be there. My name is Pratik Patel. I work at IBM. I do all these things, but here we're going to talk about Vue.js. So what I'd like to do first is just, for those of you who aren't familiar with Vue, talk a few minutes about why Vue is important and what are some of the differences between Vue and React and Angular and other libraries which are out there. And then we'll do some live coding and actually see Vue in action, and we'll talk about some of the things which make Vue different and interesting. But first, let's talk about Vue.js. For me, the biggest thing about Vue.js is that it has a low learning curve. That means that unlike a big library like Angular, where you have to pretty much learn everything to start being productive in it, Vue allows you to start very easily just with plain HTML. You don't actually even need to have npm installed or build system or have anything installed. Literally, you just need the Vue library to be able to code in Vue, and it's very easy to get started with, and it's also very intuitive, right? So, Vue is often referred to as what's known as a progressive framework. So we start with just the Vue core library, and then we can add in features as we need them to do certain things. So when you're starting with Vue, you can just start with the very core of Vue just to do something very straightforward and simple. And then as you need to do different things like, let's say, in-browser routing, or you need to do state management, you can add in those different parts of Vue to be able to do those things. Now, one of the other nice things about Vue compared to, for example, the React world is that there are a number of different ways, for example, in React to do state management. A lot of people use Redux, and some people in the React world use something called MobX, and there are other solutions out there as well. Right? Some people also even mix in React.js or RxJS into a React or even an Angular application, right? But in the Vue world, there's typically only one way to do something that you need. So for example, if you want to do state management in Vue, the choice that you would make is for Vuex. There's not like 5 different ways to do the same thing in the React world, and that is deliberate. So what the React team does is they look at the different features that you might need as a web developer, and then they essentially they pull in something from the community, or they wrap something in, and that becomes the de facto way of doing something like route management or state management or whatever inside of Vue. So again, it's a progressive framework. We start simple and we add in features as needed. Now, the other thing about Vue that I really like is that it is very intuitive. As you see me code through the demos, you'll be like, well, this actually makes sense. There's no trickiness to it. Everything is, especially the conventions seem natural. So this is what makes programming in Vue quite nice. It's actually intuitive, and you can get started with it very quickly, and you can be productive very fast. Now, one thing that's interesting about Vue compared to React and Angular is that Vue is not backed by a company. It's 100% community driven, and it has a very large community, which is great. So, for example, Angular is backed by the folks at Google. React is backed by the folks over at Facebook. But Vue is 100% community driven. Okay, so they take donations, or you can contribute open source or documents or whatever. But that's one of the things that makes Vue unique, is that it's 100% driven by the community, and community members put forward ideas for features. And of course, over time, features are pulled into the framework as as the need comes up. So one of the big things that's coming up in Vue 3, for example, is the ability to use TypeScript with Vue. And this is something that, again, has been driven by the community. A lot of folks in the Vue community have expressed a desire to be able to use TypeScript to build Vue applications instead of just standard ES6 or ES7. So that is coming in the next version of Vue, which is due very shortly. Okay? All right. So it's time for some live coding, and we all know how this goes, but I will do my best to not make it a train wreck as you see here. All right. So let's pull up a quick application here, and let's make sure that that font is big enough. There we go. Make it a little bit bigger. Okay. So here we have just a plain web page. There's no tooling or anything around this. So if I drop into the directory where this project is running, you will see, let's make this bigger. You'll see that there's nothing in here but HTML files, okay? So let's go and have a look at this. Standard HTML, there's a script tag in here. We'll talk about all the things that are going on in here in just a second. But what I'm doing is I'm pulling a version of the Vue library directly from a repo online, okay? So it's unpackage.com Vue. That basically pulls in Vue core for us to use in this example application. Right, and we have the example app right over here. So let's have a look at a couple of things that are in here. First, let's jump down to the script and let's look at how we initialize a Vue application in the browser. So you can see I have this highlighted. What I do here is I'm saying create a new application. We want to attach the application at this element called hashtag app, and here's the div that represents our Vue application. Okay, and then I have a data block in here that has some data that we're going to use in a few minutes. Okay, this is actually off a little bit. Let's go fix that. Oh. Anyways, and then we have something called methods. So what we've done so far is we've just initialized a new Vue application with a data and a methods portion that we're going to use in a few minutes. Okay, so this is simple initialization. And let's go look at the template that represents this Vue application. So again, this is where our app will be mounted inside of hashtag app. And you can see I'm pulling in an image here. This is just standard HTML. Now, this is the interesting part right here. So I have something called v-html equals greeting. So this v, whenever you see a v dash in Vue, that is essentially what we call a directive. And in this case, what we're going to do is do some template substitution. So this v-html will find the data element called greeting, which is right here. And you can see that it just says, hello, Devoxx. Let's go fix this. Let's put 2018 in here. Let's reload our page. And you can see that that's where our change gets reflected. And what this directive is doing is it's signaling to the Vue framework that we want to take whatever is in this and replace that with the text that would normally appear inside of this H1. Okay? So you might be thinking, well, v-html, what's v-text do? Let's go save that. And let's go load this, and you'll see when we do just a v-text, it takes what we have as the text and injects it as the text for that specific tag that we're inside, in this case an H1. When we do a v-html, however, it assumes that we're going to pass it in some HTML markup, and it essentially adds a child or adds that HTML as a child in the as a DOM element rather than just substituting in the text. So there's a little bit of a subtle difference in here in terms of the way that Vue works with the DOM when we use v-text versus v-html. Okay, so you can see now that I've changed this back to v-html and I have some HTML in here, instead of just updating the text inside of the H1, it will actually go and create a sub-element or child element inside of that specific place in the DOM. So when I reload this, you'll see that this is showing as we intended, which is as a HTML italics type of element with some text inside of it. Okay, so that's one way that we can go and inject data into our Vue template. And again, what I'm defining here is a Vue template for our little application. The other way that I can do this is I can use double curly braces and then go and, in this case, I'm just showing the date, but we can go reuse this thing as well. So if I come in here and get rid of this and just put greeting, and oops, let's go reload this. You can see that it puts that greeting directly as text. So there are a couple of different ways that we can go and put or do template injection here. We can use a directive, either v-text or v-html, depending on what we want to put in. Or we can use double curly braces to go and do template substitution like so. All right, so if I go and save this, you'll see that we get this back, and I'm doing a toString here. Now let's see what happens if we just try to get that date. And again, the date is this thing right here. I'm just doing a new date right here. I could actually come in here and just do new date. Okay, let's go save that and run it, and you can see that I'm basically just running JavaScript directly inside of where we would normally just do template substitution. So when we see those double parentheses, this is what we typically refer to in the Vue world as an expression, right? So I can just go and put a reference to a variable in there, and it will just show the variable as we have it, or I can actually just go put some code in there, and that's what we call an expression. Okay, so let's go revert that and make that string look a little bit nice, right? And we could use a formatter or something if we wanted to show the string in a little bit nicer way. All right, so the next thing we want to do is, how do we do some conditionals inside of Vue? Okay, so I have div v-if time is greater than 17, it's time for beer. And if we go down here, you can see I have a variable here called time with just an int inside of it, or a number, and it says 18. So right now it thinks it's time for beer. If I go and change this from 18 to, let's say, what time is it now? It is actually 1400 hours. So we'll go save that and we'll reload, and you'll see that instead of getting time for beer, I now get time for lunch here. Okay? And I've used another directive here. So first I use v-if to check something, i.e. have a conditional inside of it. And here I'm going to say, well, if this if condition isn't satisfied, I see that there's a v-else here, so of course, it's just a standard if-else statement here, again, wrapped as directives inside of our little Vue application. Okay? So that's all relatively straightforward. And we can also use these methods. We'll come back a little bit later and look at these methods. Right? But again, this is a very simple Vue application. We've done some template substitution. We've talked about conditionals. And we have also looked at a few different directives that we can use to construct a Vue application using a Vue template. Now, let's switch over to something. Well, let's go have a look, see what we have that is a little bit more complex, right? So let's go actually look at this toggle right here, right? So this is number 2. So we'll come in here and say open 2.html. All right. So let's go have a look at this little sample application. Again, you can see I'm not using Webpack. I'm not using any tooling. We'll do that in a few minutes, right? When we build a real world Vue application, we will typically have a little project that gives us the ability to do live code reloading and other things like that, which we'll talk about in a couple of minutes, okay? All right, so let's have a quick look at this app right here. And there's some interesting things that we want to cover. Again, we still have this v-html here, okay? But obviously in our web application, we're going to want to have the ability to use styles. And there are a couple of different ways that I'm using styles in here. I'm using another directive here called v-bind :style. So this will bind into the style attribute for this specific tag. And what I'm giving it here is a JavaScript object that says this is the color, go pull the app name from somewhere, and here's the top. Let's just go make sure this works first. Let's go increase this to like 100 or something. Okay. And of course, that's not reloading properly for some reason. But let's come down here and have a look at how these styles are actually defined. So there are two different ways I can define the styles. Here I'm just using a plain HTML object, which is not what we typically do. What we prefer to do is use some kind of array format like this to say these are the different styles that will be affixed to this element. And if we scroll down in our application, okay, you can see we have a style section here, and then inside of the style section we can go and declare different things that we wish to use, or what we can do is we can also say here's our greeting style and here's our header, right? And if we go back up, you can see we're using greeting style and header inside of our data element, so we can also define this as JavaScript if we like, right? So we can go change the greeting style from this to some other color, and hopefully this works, right? So you can see that that style has actually changed by me going in and swapping out the color style that's in here, right? So this is the way that we can bind into attributes specifically for an element. All right, so let's have a look at another way of, or a way for us to go and iterate directly inside of a template. So what I'm saying in here is I'm using a directive called v-4 for the URL in URLs, go and print this template out, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about what's in this template in just a second. But let's go look at what we have for our URL. So we have 3 different URLs right here, docs, Discord, forum, whatever, right? There are 3 different URLs here. And you can see they're getting printed right here on this side. Okay. Now, I say v-4 URL in URL, so that URL is getting pulled from this data element right here. Again, this is where we define our Vue application. This is where we declare what data is available inside of our Vue application. And we will iterate over this and go and put in the specific portion, right? Now, one thing to note here is that I've used :href here to go and dynamically set what the href, or what the target is for this anchor, right? And this URL variable is materialized inside of this loop right here, and that's what we're using. But you can see I haven't used a v-bind here. And so I could use that. Let's just reload that and make sure it works. You can see it's coming up exactly the same. So you don't always have to use this v-bind. In fact, you can just leave that out and just do : whatever it is that you're trying to set. So we can be verbose about it and say v-bind the attribute style, or we can just say :href, go bind that specific HTML attribute for this tag just by doing a colon. And we use the colon here, of course, so that we get the dynamic nature of Vue to be able to do a template injection or template insertion for this specific tag. And of course, we're just showing the URL here. So nothing too fancy here, right? So this is how we do loops inside of a Vue template. It's relatively straightforward, as you can see. All right. So let's talk about how do we capture events, or how do we handle mouse clicks and things like that. All right, so here I have v-on. When this thing is clicked, and you can see I've declared a button, which is right here, toggle logo. All right, and let's see what that actually does when we hit that. Okay, you can see that the logo disappears and appears as we go and hit toggle logo. But let's start from the beginning and see how that actually shapes, or how that actually works. All right, so there are a couple of different ways that I've done this here. I have 2 logos here, as you can see. They're both pointing to the same logo.png. Okay, but let's look at this v-if case first. So I say image, here's my class, v-if show logo is equal to true, go and show it. Right, so let's go down and have a quick look at where this show logo is defined. Okay, so we have toggle logo here, which is what we're hitting when we hit that button. Right, so we have this button, on click, toggle logo. That is this method right here, again, that we have defined inside of our Vue application. Right, so what this does, it says this .show logo equals not this .show logo. So it just flips it back and forth. Right, and of course, we have show logo as is what we're using up here to go and define if that thing is showing or not. Okay, so the alternative way that I've done this is I've also used a class here that says logo true, hide, not show logo. Right, so I've done it in 2 different ways. One using a Vue directive, and then one using a CSS style. And they both do the same thing, as you can see. When I hit this, both logos disappear or appear depending on what the state of this show logo variable is. Okay, so there are a couple of ways that we can go and show and not show HTML, and how we can use an if with some methods inside of a Vue application also. Right, so we have logo, we say hide, so we specifically set the class to hide as true or false, and that will show it based on the state of this. And one of the ways that I like to think about Vue is somewhat like a reactive type of framework. So when we go and change something in the data, it filters through the Vue system, and anything that references that specific variable will get reacted to. So in some ways it's reactive. So when we hit this, what we're doing is we're getting this click, toggle logo, and that toggle logo is actually going and manipulating a data element that we have right here. Right? So initially we just set it to true. Okay? But when we hit this function and we update the show logo inside of the data, that signals to Vue that something has changed inside of our Vue application, and Vue will react to that change based on the data that we have changed. In this case, we've just toggled something called show logo. Okay, so in some ways, we also think of Vue as a reactive type of a web framework, because as we go and make changes to the data, the application reacts to what we've changed and adjusts, or we code it to adjust what we're showing on the screen. Okay, all right. So a couple of extra things we introduced here: how we do looping, how we use styles, and also how we go and respond to user interaction in our Vue app. And at this point, you basically are ready to program pretty much any application in Vue. You don't really need much else at this point to be able to build a Vue application. But let's look at a couple more things real quick. Okay, so let's open up 3.html and have a quick look at a HTML form. Okay, so here we have just a basic HTML form. Let's go put something in. Whatever, doesn't matter. Just pick something. We'll hit submit. You can see that as I was typing here, that stuff was happening, right? But we'll talk about this in just a second. There is one thing I want to talk about very quickly, though. Let's talk about, for example, we have this v-heading here, which is pointing to this heading attribute that we have right here. Enter your presentation details. You can see I have in italics. Actually, let's go change that to a bold. And let's go reload this, and now that'll be a little bit different or whatever, right? So let's change it back to italics. But anyways, I'm using this data element called heading here. And I'm using a v-html as we did before. Now, one thing that we can do as a developer to help increase the overall performance of our Vue application or our Vue components is we can say that, well, we should only render this heading once, because it's unlikely that the heading will change. Let's just assume that the heading is not supposed to change in this case, right? So we can do a v-once in here. Okay, let's reload that. And then if we were to dynamically go and change this heading, it would not go and get updated except for the very first time that this is seen by Vue. And the reason we do this, or the reason why we use v-once, is so that we decrease the total amount of overhead that our Vue application has to track, or all the different things our Vue application has to track. If we know something is never going to change, but we're using something from the data to be able to dynamically render it, when we use that v-once, it signals to Vue, well, I don't really anticipate any changes to this specific thing. So don't include it in the model that we have for going and doing updates to our application. So it just removes things that would normally be dynamic and reduces the amount of total overhead that the Vue application has. It reduces the number of things it has to track, so it makes our app run a little bit faster every time we use v-once. Okay. So let's have a look and see what's going on in this form, right? So we have a couple labels, we have some input fields, and let's look at the way that Vue does two-way binding. So if you're in the Angular world, you're probably familiar with what two-way data binding is. Vue also does two-way data binding. If you work in the React world, you probably know that React does not do two-way data binding. It uses what's called one-way data flow. So that's one way that Vue is different than React, right? Vue supports two-way data binding, very similar to the way that Angular does two-way data binding. Okay, so let's have a look real quick at how this actually works. So let's just pick this title field, for example, right? So you can see as I type there, we can see at the bottom that something is getting printed out, but let's actually investigate that and have a quick look. All right, so I have something called input. Well, I have a standard input tag here, type equals this, name, ID, and now I'm introducing a new directive called v-model. So when you use v-model, you get two-way data binding. Okay? And you can see I have several different callouts for v-model, name, presenter, email, etc., right? So I'm using v-model in several different places here. Okay? And those v-models will bind directly to something that we've declared inside of the data. Right, so in this case, we're interested in talk title. So let's go reset this to insert title here. Let's go save that. And you can see that I will get some initial, like if you need to set a default for a field, you can do it simply by going in to the data and setting it like so. Okay, but let's see what happens with the reactive stuff here, right? So again, we have this talk title. We bound it using v-model to this specific variable. And then right down here, all I'm doing is I'm just printing it out using the expression-based syntax for printing out those specific things that we have in our form. Okay? So again, because I've set that as a v-model, we get that two-way data binding. So when the variable changes inside of this field, it will go and automatically do an immediate insertion of whatever the new value is wherever it appears inside of this Vue component or this Vue application. Okay? So two-way data binding, v-model. We don't have to worry about going and grabbing the value as the user enters it because it automatically appears inside of our data variable location whenever we go and use v-model. All right, so a couple more things here really quickly. Right, so we have this. All right, this is how we show tracks. All right, so we've had these hard-coded, but we could use a v-4 if we wanted to and have this inside of an array and then go dynamically print it if we wanted to. Okay, let's just make sure we've covered everything here before we move forward. Right, so we talked about v-model, right? We'll talk a little bit more about submit if we have time and how we can go and hit a network resource and get stuff out of it. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump ahead a little bit further ahead and make sure that, just want to make sure we've covered everything here before we go back to the slideware. Okay, so actually this is a good point at which we can go and jump out into a different Vue project that's a little bit more what we would use in day-to-day practice. All right, so what I have here, let's zoom in a bit, is I created an application using the standard Vue project creation tool. So you go to the command line, you say Vue new project, and then we'll ask you what type of project you want to create based on some templates that are available inside of the Vue library. But I've just created a simple Vue with router type of project. And let's go talk about how we do component-based programming and how like a more real-world project looks like in the Vue framework. Okay, so let's go over here, make sure we have the right thing open here. Okay, so we go look at the project structure very quickly. Let's zoom in a bit here. Does that look okay? Yep, there it is. All right, so we have a bunch of different folders here. The ones that we really care about are the source and the static folders. Okay, so static is where we would put like images and other things like that, which we anticipate to be static. And then we have assets that we can also put in here that will be pre-processed. So the difference between static and this assets folder is things that you put into the assets folder will actually run through the Webpack packager and optimizer and things like that. We can look at that in a second and like basically do a distribution build as well. Okay, and then we have our main.js, which is our initial entry point for this Vue application. So we have import Vue from Vue, et cetera, right? And you can see this is where we declare a new Vue application and we're binding it into the hashtag app. And this is what our router looks like, right? We're going to look at the router in just a second. Okay. And then our initial entry point for this thing is something called app. So let's go look at app.vue. And if you look closely now, it's no longer an HTML file. We've called this a .vue file. Because what we're doing now is instead of having just a single page Vue application, we're creating a component-based Vue application with multiple components inside of it. And of course, the idea behind component-based programming is that we have reusable components. Okay, but let's look at this app component very quickly first. So we have assets logo.vue, which is this thing right here. And then we're going to export this and we're going to go attach some stuff to it. But the main thing we're interested in here is we have router-vue, which goes and does the in-browser URI routing that we have. So let's go look at the router. It's an index.js. Okay. So I'm going to import the standard Vue router here. I'm going to say Vue, use this router that we have right here, and go and declare the router with these routes. In this case, you can see I only have one route, which is /, which points to a component called hello world 2. And if we look at how we import that, we have hello world 2 at /component/hello world 2. So let's go into our components folder and open up Hello World 2. And again, this is another Vue component. Now you can see that we have something that's non-standard HTML here. We have a template tag. Okay, so our template tag again contains our markup or our template that we will do different things in, and you probably recognize some of the things we did here. We say v-if hours is less than 12, good morning, good afternoon, etc., and then we're just going and injecting a URL here also. Okay, so and we're going to use Axios in a minute to make a network call, but let's look at this component very quickly. And let's see how it differs from what we looked at previously, which is when we were using just a single HTML file to build like a single page Vue app, non-component based single page Vue app, right? You can theoretically put multiple components into one HTML or Vue file, but that's not a best practice. We typically put our components into different files because that's what makes sense, okay? But you can see we say export default. So we're using ES6/ES7 style HTML or a JavaScript. We give this component a name, and now what we do is we have a data open close parens. So we're basically defining this thing in more of a function way rather than a straight object. But you can see what we do is essentially return a JavaScript object with our different things in here. So let's go and fix that. And you can see as I typed and hit save, I didn't have to go and reload the browser. So just like every other framework that's available out there, when you use this tooling that comes with the generated Vue projects, you get this instantaneous development update cycle, right? So we can go in and change different things here. So let's actually get rid of this. And that's weird. It appeared for just a second and then it went away. Why did that happen? Well, there's a good reason for that. One of the things we did inside of this Vue component, and again, let's just quickly glance at what's going on in the template. Right, nothing too fancy going on here. We have a couple of v-elfs to go say good evening or good afternoon or whatever based on the time, and then we have this message that we're showing as message, which we set right here. But what I'm using here is I'm using one of Vue's component lifecycle callbacks or hooks. And what this says is when this component is mounted, in this case, right, we're using mounted, when the component is mounted, go and run this block of code. And what this block of code is doing is it's using the Axios HTTP library to go and fetch something from the internet. Right, so we say Axios get, here's a URL. So this is hitting a serverless cloud function, which is actually written in Java, but it's hitting a serverless cloud function up in the cloud, basically that just returns hello world. Okay, so what this is doing, let me make this a little bit bigger for a second. So Axios, go and do a get against this URL, and then take the result and say this.message equals result.data.message. So if we quickly go look at this cloud function, do we have it up somewhere? Yep. So here's the cloud function. It's nothing crazy. You can see that this cloud function is just returning message hello world, right? So what we do is we say result data message, set this dot message to that, and that's why it changes, because it takes a little bit of time from the time that we've mounted our application or the time that we initialize our Vue application, right? So if you watch right here, right, in just a second, as it takes a little bit of time to go hit that cloud function and get the data back. But that's what's happening in this case, right? So this mounted is a good place where we can go and load stuff that we need for initialization or to just show some data or whatever inside of our Vue application, right? But you have to be, there obviously more than one a lifecycle hook for a Vue component. Mounted is one place where you can go and say, okay, let's go run some code to populate the data that should be in this component. In this case, what we would rather do instead of having a default message here is we could say something like loading data ... Right? And then if we reload that, you'll see that for a second it says loading data, and then when the data comes in, the data is shown. Okay, but there are other things. We can do stuff when a component unmounts, if it's about to mount, after it's mounted, et cetera, et cetera. There are different lifecycle hooks, which if you've used React, you're familiar with. They have similar types of hooks inside of the React framework to go and do a little bit more complex and sophisticated things for components. Okay? All right, so let's look at a couple of other things here really quickly. All right, so we talked about the router, how we set up the routing. We looked at this hello world, and we talked about styles a little bit already, right? So there are a couple of different ways. There are a couple of things I want to mention here, actually, before we go too far down this path. Let's actually flip back over to our forum example really quickly. There's something important that we need to discuss before we really move on to our next topic, okay? So if you remember, I had this form here, which had this form here. One of these guys. There we go. There's our form, okay? So we had this form, and we have, as you can see on the screen, we have name, email, title, track, etc., right? So these are the elements or the data in our form. Now, you might be thinking, well, what if I don't know what data is contained inside of this dynamic component? Right? Maybe I want to do like a dynamic form or something like that. Now, the one rule around the way that we structure and think about the data part of our Vue application is that at design time, the data is essentially our schema. And then at runtime, our data becomes our actual data, right? It becomes essentially what we show on the page if we're building a form or whatever. The one thing that you cannot do in Vue is you cannot dynamically go at runtime and, oops, what happened there? I didn't want to delete all that. There we go. Let's say we wanted to add a new data element, right? So we could theoretically do that. We could go into, let's pull this up real quick. Right, so you can see we have a method called toggle here, and let's say we did this dot new variable, or let's call it new data variable equals, I don't know, something, right? So you might think that doing this will go and inject a new data element inside of your Vue component, but it actually does not. Essentially, when your Vue component is initialized, the data is set and is not able to be changed anymore, right? I don't mean the data itself. I don't mean the values that are in, right? I don't mean the values that are here, but it's the shape of the data is no longer changeable once your Vue component is initialized. So you can't dynamically go and add a new data element at runtime, right? So again, the way we think about this in the Vue world is that our data is our schema at development time, and then at runtime, it is locked or frozen in terms of the shape of the data, not the actual data itself. You obviously saw that we changed the talk title and the presenter email and stuff like that here, right? So obviously the data itself or the data values change, but the shape of the data itself does not change. Okay, so this is a limitation inside of Vue, but it is there's a reason why that's there. Because if we allow dynamic data inside of a Vue component, the framework would have to do a lot more work, i.e. it would make the Vue framework perform considerably less fast. Okay, so we lock the data at runtime, and the reason for that is so that we ensure top performance inside of the Vue framework. Okay, and let's talk about performance for just a second as well. If you look at some performance numbers that have come out from the Vue team, without saying anything super controversial, since this is being recorded, the Vue framework has amazing performance compared to both React and Angular. Right? I won't say anything more than that. You can do a Google search yourself and see what numbers people have put out there in terms of how does the Vue framework performance compare to Angular or React or whatever else. Okay, but it has best-in-class performance, and this is another reason why Vue is great, is because it's super, super fast, and as long as you follow some simple rules, you can apply some extra optimizations like v-once, the data gets locked down, right? There is a way to do dynamic components, but we typically want to try to avoid that, again, because it takes a performance hit if we go and allow just dynamic data components inside of our application. Okay, so I think I've covered pretty much everything in terms of the basics. Let's get back to our slides and make sure that I haven't missed anything. Right, so we've done the live coding portion here. Right, let's do a quick review. We talked about the view structure. Normally we split things into components. Oh, one thing we didn't do actually is, let's go into, again, this is our like project, view component project, right? And if we go look at our package.json, you can see it's importing a bunch of stuff, right? And one thing that we didn't talk about is there are ways to do unit tests directly inside of Vue. And again, this is one of the reasons why Vue is great. Vue prescribes you a single way to do things for pretty much everything you would need to do as a developer. If you need to do state management, you use Vuex. If you need to do routing inside of your Vue application, you use Vue Router. And you can see out of the box, we get, for this specific thing, we get a test framework that's also embedded inside of this Vue project, right? So we can actually write tests. You don't have to write tests using this way. There's actually a very nice book that goes into how to do proper testing with Vue, and there's a lot of material out online as well that show you what to do in terms of testing a Vue application. But you can see that this is specifically, well, if I zoom in, you can see that Vue comes bundled, this project at least comes bundled with Jest, but you can use another a testing framework if you like if you use Cypress.io, which is a very advanced open source testing framework, you can use that. But at the unit test level, at least, it comes with this built in. Okay. All right. So we talked about how we split components. We talked a little bit about how Vue instance templates, data methods, and filters come together. Right. At dev time, the schema. At dev time, the data property is a schema. At runtime, it becomes the model. We cannot add or remove props at runtime, so we've already talked about this in detail already. Data prop values can only be primitives. That's numbers, strings, dates, arrays, etc. We looked at binding as well, semantic binding versus declarative binding. So when we use the double parentheses, or sorry, double curly braces, that is semantic versus declarative binding. We looked at the difference between v-text and v-html. And we didn't really get into expressions too much, but maybe we have time to look at an expression as well. So expression is something that returns a value, and we use that directly in a Vue template when we just did like new data, right? We have two-way data bindings. How does that work? It's magic. Bindings are reactive. We used view-once, or we talked about that. So when something doesn't need to change at runtime, we don't want to add extra overhead into the Vue framework. So we avoid that. That message will never change. At runtime performance, we talked about how it updates the inner HTML when we use HTML. Right? So one thing to note about using v-html is you do have to be careful when you bind that HTML because, as you can see on this slide right here, when we do v-html, it is binding directly into the DOM. So we want to make sure we put HTML that we trust, that we know is good, because we are doing injection directly into inner HTML without any additional checking. Okay, so we talked about binding attributes, :href or v-bind href. There are extra directives, right? So here's one that we looked at for href, v-bind href. But one thing that we didn't talk about is what are called modifiers. So on the second example here, I have v-on submit.prevent. Okay, so there are these modifiers that we can add on in certain situations, and what the prevent does is it basically prevents propagation of that event further up into the DOM, right? So there's a bunch of different ones. Let's look at some. Actually, they're coming up in just a sec. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about CSS binding. We can use a JavaScript array or JavaScript object as we saw before, and this works especially when we need to do dynamic style of CSS. But what we typically like to do is not actually go down this road, but you probably saw this already. We prefer just to have stuff as plain CSS and use it appropriately inside of our Vue application, right? So what that means is we have the CSS like so, and then we can just go reference that thing directly, right? So if we flip back to one of our components, let's go look at this. Right, so if we go look at this hello world, let's look at the right one. You can see that inside of this component, there's a style block where I go and define what the CSS properties for things inside of this component look like. So when we do styling in Vue, there are two different ways we can do this. Each component can have its own style, or a component can also inherit styles from a parent component or from somewhere else. Okay, so we may have a single CSS file that contains all of our styles for every component, and then we can override them or have special styles where we need them directly inside of the component, as you see here. Okay, all right, let's make sure we've covered everything real quick. Talk about a few other things along the way. All right. All right, so expressions are something that we can go and execute inside of a block. So you can see we have a couple of expressions here in these two v-ifs. You've seen this already, right? We said if show logo equals true, then go show that thing, and then we use the v-if several times to do different things. But there are a few limitations. When those expressions run, they run in a little bit of a limited environment. So they're running obviously inside of the JavaScript interpreter in the web browser, but you don't have access to everything inside of that expression block. Okay, you have access to a limited set of globals, and it's kind of running inside of the component itself. So you can't see everything inside of the Vue application, like the whole Vue application. You only have access inside of expressions to that specific component only, right? So you can't have something in an expression in component A that can go and look at some data that's in component B. It's running in an isolated environment within that component itself, right? And this is what we want when we write components, is we want isolation and the ability for components not to step on each other. And if we look at this Vue component, like kind of from a high level here, you can see we have a template that defines what the component looks like. We have our script stanza, which defines basically the behavior of the component. And then we also have a style section, which goes and allows us to do stylings for that specific component. So each component is completely a freestanding thing that does not necessarily rely on something outside of that component. Obviously, you can inherit properties from parent components and get CSS from outside, but the idea is that a component is a freestanding unit that is reusable in multiple different places. Right? That's the whole point behind components, and specifically web components or web-based components. We looked at forms. We get two-way data binding, and one thing that we didn't cover here, but say for example you have right, this is what we showed in our code. We said, okay, these are the different options we have when we select this specific thing. But if we have that coming in as JSON, or maybe we want to define it dynamically, you can see here on the fourth line, we do option v-4 option and options. And you've seen what a loop looks like in Vue already. And so you can imagine that this is how we would dynamically render a select HTML component inside of Vue. Okay. Similarly, if we wanted to have like different checkboxes, we could just say, you know, in this case, we just go and model that using a dash value option and v-dash model around a checkbox. Okay. So let's look at a few more modifiers really quickly. We looked at the .prevent very quickly earlier, but there are some really handy modifiers, especially when working with forms or the model. So we can say v-model.trim, v-model.number, make sure it's a number, v-model.lazy, right? So lazy would be a way of almost like doing a debounce. So as we're typing stuff, don't like go and show it immediately. Let's actually try that real quick. Where was our format? Okay, so we had this form here, and let me make sure I'm in the right file. That was 3.html. Okay, so let's go to 3.html. And let's make sure we're in the right place first. Okay. All right, so we're in the right place. And let's use this email field, actually. So you can see as I type in the email field, something gets printed out. So let's go into here and say v-model.lazy, save, reload, and hopefully this works as intended. Okay. So you can see in this case, it's bound to the model, but it's not actually going to go and do anything until we go and ask for it. Okay, so this is another way that we can get a little bit of a performance improvement by saying, as someone's typing into this, we don't actually want to go get that value. We'll go get that value later when we need it. Okay, so a couple of more things. You can do modifier chaining. So you can saw we had a .trim, .lazy, .number, and we could say v-model.lazy.trim. So we can actually stack or chain these modifiers so that we can directly inline go and make those changes. We looked at events very quickly. They map to standard DOM events. We also looked at conditionals. We looked at loops as well. And that's pretty much it, right? So some of the things we can do in terms of modifiers for events is we can say on click, prevent propagation or stop propagation here. Only allow someone to click a button once. The target should be itself, right? And we can do more specific event modifiers as well inside of an input field, for example. We could say keyup.enter. So when the person hits enter, go and run this method that we have defined inside of our application. I've listed out some of the different things that we can attach as modifiers inside of a specific area. Okay, so we also looked at networking. Axios is what's preferred in the Vue community for doing networking, but you can use whatever you want. You're not necessarily restricted to that. In this case, what I did is I used an IBM Cloud function to go and do this stuff. And when I build applications, I tend to build them using a serverless style because the kind of simplicity of a serverless application works really great with the simplicity of a Vue application. But of course, if you have an existing Java or Python or whatever app, you can put Vue in front of it and not have any trouble. All right, so very quickly, some things we didn't talk about. Watchers, computed properties, sorry, not computer properties, but computed properties. We didn't really get into filters, but filters are also chainable like this. All right, so we can say for the result, we have a method called remove space and a method called go and title case that, so we can actually go and inline that directly in our code as well. Okay, we mentioned Vuex and state management, but we didn't get into that, right? We talked a little bit about routing. We didn't really get into server-side rendering, but of course, like every other modern framework, Vue supports the ability to do SSR or server-side rendering of an entire application or of an individual component itself. All right, and with that, I'm out of time, but I thank you for coming. I hope you enjoyed this session.